When it comes to building muscle, genetics is absolutely a real thing, and it will determine how successful you can be in terms of building your physique. However, if you have average or even below average genetics for building muscle, that doesn't mean that you can't still develop a top 1% physique amongst the population or even top 5% amongst lifters if you stick with it long enough and you train correctly. I personally do not consider myself to have superior genetics when it comes to bodybuilding. I'd consider myself somewhere probably just around average. Yet I've still managed to build quite a significant amount of muscle. Now I'm no Mr. Olympia, but I think I've built quite an impressive physique and I'm certainly proud of it, which is ultimately what matters, right? So in this video, I want to go over the different ways that genetics may impact your training, your results, and what it means to have average versus elite genetics. And then I'm going to go over how you may have to train differently if you have average genetics. So without further ado, let's get into it. So when it comes to genetics, ultimately there's going to be three different ways that this is going to impact your results. The first one is going to be your response to the stimulus. So think about when you're a beginner, your response to the training stimulus is the highest it ever will be, meaning that your rate of progression is going to be very fast because your body is so sensitive to the stimulus. And then after a certain point, that stimulus kind of wears out and your progress begins to slow down. Now, one aspect of having elite genetics just means that your response to that stimulus will constantly be at a higher threshold, let's say, than somebody with average genetics. So for example, let's say two individuals started training at the same time in the gym and their baseline was relatively similar, meaning they had a similar amount of muscle mass to start and a similar amount of strength. So let's say on their first day in the gym, they can bench one plate for, I don't know, a rep or two. The guy with the elite genetics is going to progress faster because each time they do a set with that 135 or each time they get a session in, his response to that stimulus is going to be greater. So he's going to get more muscle growth from each session, meaning he will probably reach a 225 bench faster than the guy with the slower response time, simply because his threshold is lower. He doesn't respond as well to the stimulus, therefore he builds less muscle as a result of each individual one. So the guy with elite genetics may reach the 225 bench in 4 or 5 months, while the next guy with average genetics may take 8 months to a year, simply because it takes him more time to build up the required amount of muscle to do so. And you can see how over the course of an entire training career, let's say 10 years plus, even though both of them are going to have diminished returns because that's just a natural part of training, if the guy with elite genetics can maintain a higher threshold even throughout that diminishing return, he'll still be able to build more muscle and get to his result faster. Which brings me to the second way that genetics impacts your training. So I just finished saying that if the guy with elite genetics has a more sensitive response to the stimulus and he's able to maintain that over the longer period of time, he's going to get better results and he's going to get them quicker. However, that may not always be the case because another way that genetics impacts your results is your overall ceiling for muscle mass. So someone may have a higher threshold or a better response to the stimulus and therefore make progress early on initially than a guy with a slower response. But the guy with the slower response may have a higher ceiling for muscle growth, meaning his body may be able to hold more muscle mass and he may have a higher genetic potential. So in the first 2, 3 years, maybe the guy with the better response builds a more impressive physique, but he then plateaus because his genetic potential isn't as high as the next guy, who may take another 5, 6, 7 years to hit his potential, even though it took him a longer time. And if they both then train for 10, 15 years, if the guy with elite genetics in terms of response was plateaued after 6, 7 years, and the guy with the average genetics in response time but elite genetics in ability to actually build more muscle mass, he's going to then take off and he's going to have the more impressive physique at the end of it. Basically, what I'm trying to say is you may not have elite genetics in one area, but elite genetics in another area. So in terms of the two that I've just discussed, you may have an elite response time, meaning you progress extremely fast early on, but you may have a lower ceiling in terms of your potential to build a total amount of muscle. Or you could have the inverse, which is a slower response time than another individual, but an overall higher potential to build muscle mass. Now, if you're extremely elite, you'll have a combination of both. And these are usually the guys who are at the top of the game, pro bodybuilders, elite influencers, things like that. Now, the third way that genetics will impact your physique is more so going to be aesthetic. And this has to do with your muscle shape, insertions, and bone structures. So essentially, this is going to be the purest form of genetics in terms of how they express themselves visually. Maybe one guy's blessed with perfect chest insertions, a nice straight line down his rib cage because the muscles attach perfectly, while the next guy may be less fortunate and have a big gap in his chest, which doesn't look as impressive. Or maybe when it comes to the biceps, somebody has longer insertions, which make them look more impressive standing relaxed, but the next guy with shorter insertions is more impressive when he flexes. Bone structure is also a big one in terms of clavicle width, most importantly when it comes to bodybuilding. Everybody usually references Steve Reeves because he was known for having really long clavicles, which then made his waist appear smaller. But your waist width itself is also genetic, so it more so matters on the proportions. If you have really narrow clavicles and a wider waist, you may have a lot more muscle mass than another guy with favorable proportions, yet he'll still look more impressive than you, especially if he's leaner and has better insertions. So these are all going to impact how you look. Genetics plays a very huge role in terms of your aesthetics. However, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't train or improve your physique if you're less fortunate, because ultimately you're still going to look a lot better if you train than if you didn't. So before I move on to my training tips for guys with average or less fortunate genetics, I want to briefly discuss how to identify your genetics. Most likely, you're going to know if you have elite genetics. It's not something that you're going to have to think about. If it's something you're trying to contemplate or ask yourself, then you probably don't have elite genetics. You're most likely going to know only once you started training for a while. You'll see how your response is and how much muscle you build in how short of a period of time. So that's going to be the best way to know. But if you already look quite freaky before you start training, like you're already relatively lean, which isn't always a great sign because you can be lean without a lot of muscle mass. But if you see a lot of definition, your muscles are already relatively developed, this is probably a good sign that you're going to respond well in the gym and you're going to build a lot of muscle. Now, when it comes to what your ceiling for muscle growth is, the only way to know this is to train for a long period of time. Because like I already said, you may respond very quick to training, but you may not have a super high ceiling for overall muscle growth. So if you're someone with average or even below average genetics, what is the difference in terms of training? The answer is nothing fundamentally. Regardless of whether you have elite genetics or average genetics, the fundamentals behind muscle growth are still the same, just like they are with males and females. Our bodies are both going to respond optimally to optimal training. It's universal. The difference is that a guy with elite genetics, in terms of his response to training, can get away with being less precise. He can train 4 reps in reserve or get away with worse technique because his body's response to the stimulus is so sensitive. So ultimately what it comes down to is precision if you're someone with average genetics. You have to make up the gap between the response that he gets and the response that you get with optimal training, meaning the things that affect stimulus and recovery. The big two are going to be technique and proximity to failure. These are ultimately what are responsible for triggering that stimulus. And then recovery, making sure that your body has the resources it needs to optimally respond. Once again, because your response is going to be inferior to the next guy. Now, if the guy with elite genetics also maximizes those variables, that's when you get these genetic freaks with insane physiques, because they're obviously going to progress even faster than they would, even if their slow progress is faster than the average guy's optimal progress. Why is that? Technique is responsible for how much tension is going to be applied to the muscle at any given time in the set. This is why it's extremely important. If your technique is perfect, then you've achieved the maximum amount of muscle recruitment throughout the set. And if you can maintain that technique while pushing that muscle to failure, what you've just achieved is maximum stimulus with maximum muscle recruitment. Therefore, the most amount of muscle growth. If you then recover optimally, meaning giving your body enough calories and enough protein while sleeping enough, now you've done everything you can and you're going to progress as fast as possible. Now, the guy with elite genetics can get away with less precision. He may train with slightly worse technique, meaning less overall stimulation, and he may train 2 to 3 reps in reserve, which also causes less stimulation. However, because his body is so sensitive, he'll respond just as quick, if not faster than you. It's unfair, I know, but it's reality. But like I said, if he also optimized those things, he would just continue to progress even faster because those principles apply universally. It's not that you have to train differently, you just have to train perfectly or as close to perfect as you can. Because if you're someone with average genetics and you're not mastering your training and recovery, progress is going to be extremely slow to the point where you just think you aren't progressing at all. So that's really ultimately what it comes down to. Now, the last thing I'll say is you really don't need to worry about your genetics at all, because basically the advice I'm giving you right now is just make sure your training is as perfect as possible, which is what you should be doing anyways. You shouldn't be trying to identify if you have elite genetics or not so that you can slack off and still get good results. If you're someone with elite genetics, you should still take this advice. You should try to optimize your training to get the best results possible. And if you aren't someone with elite genetics, even if you're someone with very low or below average genetics, you should still take the same advice. You just need to train as optimally as you can to get the best results that you can. There really isn't a point in trying to identify whether you have good genetics or not, because it doesn't change what you have to do. It just changes what you can potentially get away with if your training is suboptimal. And then, of course, when it comes to aesthetics, there's nothing you can do about your muscle insertions or your bone structure. So you just have to play the hand you're dealt. But remember, like I already said, even if you have average or below average genetics, if you train for long enough and effectively enough, you can still develop a top 1% physique and something that nobody can call small or average or that you won't be proud of. So stick with it and keep tuning into my videos so you can continue to learn how to train optimally. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.